Oh, there are many people who don't understand Italian, if I understand. So I have to speak in English. The idea is to say something about ether in ancient and in modern science. I have started just by reporting what the English Wikipedia says on this subject. So if you look to the entry ether theories, it's written that this early modern ether has little in common with the ether of classical elements from which the name was borrowed. So it seems that the only things in common between the ancient idea and the early modern ether is just the name which was borrowed. If you look to the Italian Wikipedia and you look for the word aether, you just find that we have two choices. If you are interested in the two ancient or in the modern one, so there is nothing in common. So my idea is to try to show that this is not the case, but there is a continuous line between the ancient idea and the modern developments. So I start with the idea of ether before Aristotle. So the word aether is a very old Greek word. It is already used by Homer, for example. But in the first times it was very generic words. It could be used for smoke, air, sky, and so on. But in the course of time it was used mainly for particularly clear and light air. But this is not very interesting from a scientific point of view, of course. And then in the pre-Socratic philosophy, the word begins to acquire some other meaning, but these meanings are different from author to author. And for what we know of them, the ether, this is not good. Okay. And this concept does not seem to play an important role in any of the pre-Socratic philosophers. So the true starting point of the history is in Aristotle, I think. And the work of Aristotle where the idea of ether is described in extenso is the De Cielo. And in De Cielo, there is the first use of ether in cosmology. And ether is considered the first element. It is the most important. In this sense, it's the first element, but it's also the fifth element. The fifth element because Aristotle adds this element to the classical four elements of Empedocles, which were earth, air, fire, and water. And fills the celestial region. And the main features of ether is that it is eternal and inalterable. And by nature it revolves in a circle, giving motion to the celestial bodies. So for Aristotle, heavy bodies moves in a natural way, for natural motion, toward the center of the earth, and the light bodies go upward toward the sky, and the ether, which is neither heavy nor light, has a completely different motion, the motion of revolution in a circle. But I think this description in De Cielo is probably less interesting than some other remarks on the ether in other works by Aristotle. In particular, there is a passage in The Anima I have transcribed. I have transcribed also the original Greek. For one of the reasons is to show for people who don't know Greek how the Greek version is shorter than the English one. I think this is interesting in some sense. The English translation is enhanced the classical translation I have found on the web, and is particularly long, probably. However, I read the translation. Hence, our first task is to explain what light is. Now, there clearly is something which is transparent, and by transparent I mean what is visible. Maybe I have to wait. And by transparent, I mean what is visible and yet not visible in itself, but rather owing its visibility to the color of something else. Of this character are air, water, and many solid bodies. Neither air nor water is transparent because it is air or water. They are transparent because each of them has contained in it a certain substance which is the same in both, and is also found in the eternal body which constitutes the uppermost shell of the physical cosmos. Oh, this is a very long translation. In the original it's written simply in toe dio to ano somati. This is translated in the eternal body which constitutes the uppermost shell of the physical cosmos. The literal translation should be in the eternal upper body, simply. Of this substance, light is the activity. Maybe a better translation should be actuality. It's in Italian atto, it's energeia in Greek. The activity of what is transparent so far forth as it has the indeterminate power of becoming transparent. Oh, why this is interesting in my opinion? Because in the cielo, the idea is the ether is only on the celestial region and there is no ether in the sublunar region. But here it's said that there is also ether inside water and inside the air, so it seems that the ether is all pervasive. And the other interesting point that the light is just the actuality of ether, so there is a connection between ether and light. And here, I think, appears for the first time this kind of connection. So it's impossible to have light without ether. Of course, another important point in Aristotle, which is important for the following development of the concept of ether, are the statement about the impossibility of a vacuum. Now, in Hellenistic times, the idea of ether often overlaps the concept of pneuma. I have transcribed an explicit testimony on this point, which is a passage in Stobaeus. Stobaeus is a writer of the late antiquity, I think in the 5th century. And he has written, Chrysippus argued somewhat as follows, that which is pneuma moving itself toward itself and from itself, or pneuma moving itself forward and backward. And this has been taken to be pneuma because it is said to be air moving itself, and it's similar to the ether, so that they fall into a common category. So ether and pneuma can be used in the same way. There are some differences, of course, between the two concepts. In particular, pneuma has also a physiological meaning, and in this physiological meaning it is never replaced by the word ether. But in cosmology, it seems that it depends on the author. If somebody prefers to use the word ether, somebody the word pneuma. So the following testimonies are both about ether or about pneuma. But the interest point here is said that pneuma and ether both have a particular movement, which is very different from the movement described by Aristotle. Aristotle said that ether is just revolving in circle, but here there is a motion forward and backward, which is a very different kind of motion. This passage in Cleomedes, I think, is particularly interesting for the ancient concept of ether. In the cosmos, there is no void, as can be seen from the phenomena. For if the whole material world were not coalescent, the cosmos would not be by nature coherent and ordered, neither could mutual interaction exist between its parts, nor could we, without one binding tension and without the all-permitting pneuma, be able to see and hear. For sense perception would be impeded by the intervening empty spaces. So, here it's clear that the coherence of the universe is an effect of the tension of the pneuma. So this pneuma or ether has a tension. This is the essential feature. And this pneuma fills all the space between us and the sphere of the stars. And another effect of the same tension is the propagation of sound and light. Now, actually Greek scientists knew very well that sound is transmitted through air. So maybe that this means that is essential the ether or the pneuma which is inside the air, probably, is important for the propagation of sound. In any case, they knew very well that the wave nature of the sound. So we may wonder if somebody also supposed that in the same way light was some kind of wave in the ether. No, there is no explicit testimony on this point, but we have some clues. For example, there is this passage in Alexander of Aphrodisias, and he is referring to Stoics. And he writes, also, what is the simultaneous movement of pneuma in opposite directions, by which it sustains everything in which it's present, since in their own words, the pneuma, in the words of the Stoics, the pneuma simultaneously moves out of itself and into itself. So this motion, which was described as a backward and forward motion, is also described as a motion in opposite directions. And this we can suppose that this is referring to some wave which requires the motion backward and forward. No? Now I will show some passage of early modern scientists. The first one is a passage of Newton in the hypothesis explaining the properties of light. The date is 1675. And he writes, perhaps the whole frame of nature may be nothing but various contextures of some certain ethereal spirits. Ethereal spirits, we use both the words, ether and spirit, which is the translation of pneuma, of course, from the Latin spiritus, which is the translation of pneuma. All vapors condensate as it were precipitation, much after the same manner that vapors are condensed into water or exhalation into grosser substances, though not so easily condensable, and after condensation wrought into various forms, at first by the immediate hand of the Creator, and ever since by the power of nature, which by virtue of the command increase and multiply, became a complete imitator of the copies at aether by the protoplast. The protoplast is the prototype. Thus, perhaps may all things be originated from aether. Now, I think there are some points that we have to remark. The first point is that the aether plays here a very important role. All things are originated from aether. So the aether is essential, it seems. But at the same time, there is no connection between aether and Newton's optics. This is just a work on optics. And since the Newton's optics is corpuscular optics, there is no possible role for the aether. So why Newton is talking about aether? It's not clear. I will show another important passage. This is just the last paragraph of Philosophia Naturalis, Principia Mathematica by Newton in 1627. And now we might add something concerning a certain most subtle spirit which pervades and lies hid in all gross bodies, by the force and action of which spirit the particles of bodies attract one another at near distances, and cohere if contiguous. And electric bodies operate to greater distances, as well repelling as attracting the neighboring corpuscle. And the light is emitted, reflected, refracted, inflected, and heats bodies. And all sensation is excited, and the members of animal bodies move at the command of the will, namely by the vibration of this spirit, mutually propagated along the solid fundaments of the nerves, from the outward organs of sense to the brain, and from the brain into the muscles. But these are things that cannot be explained in a few words, nor are we furnished with that sufficiency of experiments which is required to an accurate determination and demonstration of the laws by which this electric and elastic spirit operates. So this is just the ending words of the masterpiece by Newton. And this conclusion is little to see with the content of all the principia, of course. So aether has no role in Newton's mechanics. But there is just this conclusion in which it seems the concept of aether as essential is very important. So we can note that this, which is called both spirit and aether and the other passages before, also is a physiological role, just as in the ancient Stoic physiology. Now, this is a good example, I think, of what can be called the fossil knowledge. I have called this kind of knowledge as fossil knowledge. So, in other words, some notions read in ancient thinkers are preserved just for the reverence toward classical texts, even if they are not inserted in the new theories in any useful way. So there is no use of this aether, but the conclusion of the principle is just about aether. And so the optics gives no role for the aether, but aether is the origin of all things, is written by Newton. Oh, here there are some passages by Hooke. This is from Hooke's Discourse on the Nature of Comets in 1682. And he writes, I judge it's necessary to demonstrate, first, that the vast expansion of the world, that is the whole interstice between the greater globular solid bodies thereof, is a body exceedingly fluid, and so fluid is hardly to be able to hinder the motion of any solid through it, much less of a body of any considerable bulk of magnitude. Secondly, Of course, there are no true demonstration of these claims. I have not reported the rest of it, but there is no true demonstration. Secondly, that this exceedingly or indefinitely fluid medium, though it do not at all, or at most very little, hinder the motion of bodies through it, is yet notwithstanding the medium by which the communication of the harmonious or inharmonious motions of the more solid parts and particles are communicated to others at a considerable distance. Oh, this is also an ancient function of the ether I have not said before, but for example there is a passage in a work attributed to Plutarch where it said that the pneuma contained in the space between Earth and Moon is the cause of the interactions, and this interaction give rise to tides. So tides are due to this interaction, due to the tension of the pneuma between Earth and Moon. Very similar is this idea of by Hooke. And that by means thereof both the motion of light is propagated outwards or from the solid void to all imaginable distance in radiating lines on orbicular pulses with an imaginable celerity. And also the gravitation or motion of descent from all imaginable distance toward the radiating body of all solid bodies is caused and produced by the like radiating lines on orbicular pulses reversed with an unimaginable celerity and prodigious power. Oh, there is another passage by Hooke, which is from his Lectures on Light in 1682. For light, as I have showed you, seems to be nothing else but an internal motion of a transparent medium. This also is very similar to the ancient statement about ether. So then, if the propagation be instantaneous, it will follow, I say, that the medium is perfectly dense, or the parts immediately contiguous one to another. So, Hooke believed that the propagation of the light was instantaneous. We have to remember that the measure of the speed of light by Remer was just 7 years before this work by Hooke. But Hooke was not convinced by Remer. His idea was that there could be some other way to explain the experimental facts. So he was convinced that the propagation was instantaneous. So, in a sense, Hooke starts to do some use of the ether because his conception of the light is not corpuscular, but at the same time is not a true wave theory, because in a true wave theory the propagation has necessarily a finite speed, and he is convinced of the instantaneous propagation. But anyway, this medium, which is the ether, is very important also for Hooke. So this is another passage which is very important, I think, is from Huygens' Traité de la Lumière in 1690. And Huygens writes, "It is inconceivable to doubt that light consists in the motion of some part of matter. And as according to this philosophy, one holds as certain that the sensation of sight is excited only by the impression of some movement of a kind of matter which acts on the nerves at the back of our eyes, there is here yet one reason more for believing that light consists in a movement of the matter which exists between us and the luminous body." The luminous body Okay. Now, if one examines what this matter may be in which the movement coming from the luminous body is propagated, which I call ethereal matter, one will see that it is not the same that serves for the propagation of sound. So, here too there is a residue of the physiological role of the pneuma. Okay, when he's talking about the nerves of the back of our eyes. But in Huygens optics, ether plays for the first time in modern science an important role, because it is just the beginning of a wave theory of light, and it's essentially for this wave theory that there is some matter, which is the ether, which can vibrate. And at the same time, it's clear that there is a continuous line between the purely fossil knowledge, which was preserved by Giordano Bruno also, and Newton and Hooke, and is used by Huygens of the concept of ether. On the other hand, I think there is also a continuous line between Huygens and his follower, until Maxwell, where the concept of ether plays an important role in all the optical theory and the electromagnetic theory after Huygens until to Michelson and Moore. Now, I think this is just an example of a general phenomenon of many ancient notions that were preserved for centuries before modern scientists were able to use it. Another example is just the shape of the Earth, for example. If you consider the shape of the Earth for Dante Alighieri, for example, he knows that the Earth is spherical, but there is no use of this notion. Both sailors and cartographers act just as the Earth were flat. So it's the knowledge which is preserved in a fossil stadium until the end of the 15th century, when the recovery of the Ptolemy's geography gives new life to this idea and allows to write a new kind of cartography. Another example, just for example, the concept of atom, or also molecule. The concept of molecule, for example, was introduced in modern science by Boyle in his work, The Skeptical Chemics, and Boyle borrows this notion from Sextus Empiricus. And the Greek word was onkos for molecule, and it's clear by reading Boyle, which is just the ancient concept which is inserted in some way in modern science. But from Boyle until to Cannizzaro, there was no real useful role of the concept of molecule. And so there are centuries in which this notion is preserved in a fossil condition until in the 19th century people finds the way of using it. So I think that the consolidator is just one example of this. I stop here. It's very short. Okay.
I think that we will answer questions if somebody
yes.
wants. Can you read something about the
Excuse me, can you repeat it?
Can you comment something about the apparent difference between ether, concept of ether and atoms? You mentioned that Newton was an atomist, and I guess also Huygens, if I remember correctly.
I don't remember I have mentioned it, but of course it's true.
How they found an agreement between these two?
I don't think so. I think that this was just two fossil knowledges, and they had to be preserved both, even if they were contradictory. But since there were ancient texts talking about atoms and other ancient texts talking by ether, and there was reverence for both, one have to talk about ether and atoms at the same time. I think it is can be explained better if you use this idea of the fossil knowledge. You know, the fossil can coexist in any way.
A question about contact action. In one of the slides you have shown, there is the concept of interaction between different material parts of a body. As this is a very modern topic in some sense. And as I know that you are also discussing in other situations about the pressure and the similar related topics in ancient science, maybe you can comment about this a little bit.
No, I don't know if I understand your question. In Huygens, if I understand, there is this idea of contact. In Huygens, there is the idea that the ether can propagate light just like a sequence of spheres. And if you pull one sphere, since all the spheres are in contact each other, then the last sphere can be moved at the same time. And this is also, of course, is a very ancient idea. So the same ideas is for example, in John Philoponus. But I think that very probably, even if we don't have direct testimony, in the ancient science there was also the idea of a wave as the form of propagation of light. And this is, for the first time, recovered by Huygens, I think.
Okay, so if there are no questions, we can stop.